Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really intriguing set of materials you've sent our way this time.
Yeah, definitely.
It covers everything from, local Massachusetts news and court documents,
Yeah.
all the way to some, ancient esoteric texts and even astrological charts. Quite a mix.
It really is. And it's fascinating how these seemingly unrelated pieces start to connect. You've given us a real puzzle here.
Seemed like it.
And the central thread linking it all, it seems to be the Norfolk Superior Courthouse, plus some very old ideas about time and energy and a current legal case that's happening there.
Exactly. So today, we're going to dive into that courthouse, the Norfolk Superior Courthouse, and this recurring mention of Box 1981. What's that about?
Right.
And we'll explore some pretty esoteric concepts that your sources talk about, things like Saturnian spells and time loops, and even touch on some, pretty unsettling ideas about how certain patterns might repeat across generations.
Yeah, that's a heavy one.
So our mission today is really to dig into these complex ideas, try to pull out what seems most important, and figure out what it could all mean.
Okay, let's start with the physical place that seems central to everything. The Norfolk Superior Courthouse.
Right.
Like you said, it comes up again and again in the materials, and there's this one specific detail that keeps grabbing attention. This box 1981 supposedly held in its archives.
That's the one. And the way your sources describe it, it's not just some dusty old box of files, is it?
Not according to them, no. The suggestion is that box 1981 is something, much more significant. They call it a frequency lock.
A frequency lock, like stuck on a radio station.
Sort of, yeah, like it's constantly replaying the same energetic patterns. And they also call it a karmic vault that came into being right around 1981.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
So the idea presented in your materials is that 1981 was this pivotal containment date.
Right.
For integrating some really intense stuff, alleged MK Ultra experiments, what's described as like legal reprogramming, and also the growing influence of media on, compliance.
And what's particularly interesting, according to these sources, is this mention of a deliberate archival gap
Yes.
in the public records at the courthouse, specifically between 1978 and 1981.
That specific window again.
Exactly. And this gap is linked, they say, to a deliberate sealing of karmic timelines. So a key takeaway seems to be this idea of intentionally obscuring information during that exact period.
Right. The narrative in the sources, it paints a picture of an implantation phase for these alleged control mechanisms happening between 78 and 81, with 1981 being the intended point of containment, almost like drawing a line in the sand to, solidify something.
And then there's another layer to this, the concept of ritualized exclusion.
Ritualized exclusion.
Yeah, as a potential reason for why certain names might be missing from the records during that time. The idea, as presented, is that maybe certain individuals, possibly tied to specific family lines, were deliberately left out.
Okay, wow. This is where it starts getting really interesting, maybe even a bit strange.
Definitely goes into some unusual territory.
It takes us into what your sources call Saturnian spells and time loops. Now, for someone who might not be familiar with these ideas, what exactly is a Saturnian spell in this context?
Well, according to these sources, which seem to draw from esoteric traditions, a Saturnian spell is described as a kind of time-based, karmic binding, energetic program.
Okay.
It's seen as mirroring certain darker rituals through its focus on binding things, creating illusions, and the materials highlight several key characteristics.
Such as, what should we look for?
Well, one key aspect they mention is chrono bonding.
Chrono bonding.
Yeah, this idea of tying souls or contracts or even physical locations like the courthouse to repeating time loops.
So like a cosmic Groundhog Day, but maybe with karmic debt involved.
That's sort of the concept, yeah,
Right.
potentially playing out consequences within that loop. Another characteristic mentioned is the use of judgment energy, but as a false kind of divine authority.
False authority. How would that show up?
The sources suggest it can manifest in legal systems that feel particularly oppressive or unfair.
Okay, that definitely seems to resonate with some of the undercurrents in the materials you sent. What else defines these Saturnian spells?
Material anchors are seen as significant.
Material anchors, like physical objects.
Exactly. The sources mention things like stone and lead-coated materials being used to essentially hold these energetic timelines in place.
And that connects directly back to the courthouse itself, right? Being a stone building.
Precisely. It's described as potentially being under this very sealed Saturnian spell. Astrological timing is also seen as crucial.
Okay.
These spells are often said to be anchored during specific Saturn transits, like its retrograde periods, or when Saturn returns to a significant point in the zodiac.
And what about the role of paperwork? You mentioned that. And it seemed like an unusual element.
Yeah, ritualized paperwork is another key signature they point out. Court documents, sealed files, even things like official records.
So everyday bureaucratic stuff could be part of it.
Potentially, yes. They're seen as possibly contributing to these spells. And this brings us right back to Box 1981 and those archival gaps we talked about.
Right, it all loops back.
And finally, there's an energetic component mentioned. These spells are described as having a kind of dense, cold, heavy, energetic feel.
Okay, so if we connect the dots here, the sources you've provided suggest the Norfolk Superior Courthouse is under this sealed Saturnian spell with time loop programming anchored around this mysterious box 1981.
That's the narrative presented, yes. It's a really compelling, if quite unusual idea.
It really is.
And it gets even more specific when we look at the astrological context of 1981 as laid out in your materials.
Okay, what's the astrological angle?
They highlight that on April 1st, 1981, the planet Saturn was in the astrological sign of Libra, around the 5th or 6th degree.
April 1st, 1981. And for those who follow astrology, Libra is associated with law, balance, justice.
Correct. And Saturn represents themes of karma, structure, restriction, lessons.
So Saturn in Libra, structure and restriction meeting law and justice.
Exactly. And the year 1981 itself is described in your materials as the year karma got coded into law because Saturn was prominently placed in Libra throughout that whole year.
Wow.
The interpretation suggests it was a period where these karmic structures were being formalized within legal and societal frameworks. So a key takeaway here is the belief within these sources that this specific alignment was seen as actively shaping the foundations of legal systems back then.
And April 1st specifically. Why that date? Was there something particular about it, according to the sources?
Yeah, that date is described astrologically as Aries, fire, meets Saturn, restriction, which leads to the phrase, trial by fire, sealed by stone.
Trial by fire, sealed by stone.
The interpretation presented suggests this energy anchored a sense of finality and restriction. And adding to that, just before, on March 4th, 1981, there was a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter at 8 degrees Libra.
Okay, Saturn and Jupiter together.
Which could have amplified themes of growth and expansion, but within that context of fairness, partnerships, and also restriction because of Saturn.
So the belief within these sources, boiling it down, is that this 1981 sealing at the courthouse supposedly harnessed what they call Saturn's frequency.
Precisely. The idea is that this energy was used to create a Saturnian spell, or maybe a containment spell.
With what goal?
With the alleged aim of binding memory, freezing trauma, and distorting perceptions of justice, especially relating to that supposed integration of MKUltra and related control systems. All those characteristics of a Saturnian spell we discussed, the Chrono bonding, the material anchors like stone, the astrological timing, they all seem to align with how 1981 is presented in your sources.
This is.
Oh!
It's a lot to take in. Definitely a very different way of looking at history and institutions.
It certainly is.
Now, let's shift gears slightly to this idea of intergenerational MKUltra. That sounds disturbing. The sources suggest that by the 1980s, MKUltra didn't just stop, but maybe adapted, became something passed down through families.
That's the claim, yes, that it evolved to become intergenerational.
How was this supposedly achieved, according to the materials you sent?
Well, the sources outline several alleged mechanisms. They suggest that institutions we usually see as helpful social services, medical trials, even educational interventions might have been used as channels.
Used for what?
To embed trauma and compliance codes into families across generations. It builds on that idea of energetic imprints anchored in 1981.
So potentially helpful systems being used for something much more insidious. That's a really disturbing thought.
That is the implication presented in your sources, yes. Custodial decisions are also highlighted as playing a potentially significant role.
Custodial decisions, like in family court.
Exactly. With children allegedly being, quote, rerouted through helpful systems, which could potentially expose them to programming and disrupt fundamental family bonds, there's even mention of a custodial handoff moment.
Well, handoff?
Yeah, specifically mentioned in relation to certain family lines in Canton, Massachusetts. It's presented as a key point where MKUltra allegedly entered specific bloodlines.
Wow. And that time frame, 1978 to 1981, keeps coming up here too.
It does. The sources call 7880 the implantation phase, where the foundations for this alleged intergenerational system were laid. And then, as we've discussed, 1981 is seen as the containment date. supposedly meant to suppress the evidence of this integration.
And what about individuals during that time?
The sources suggest that the removal or silencing or maybe even diagnosing of certain individuals during that 1978-1981 window was another tactic.
To do what?
To disrupt family structures, perhaps making subsequent generations more susceptible to programming.
Okay. And finally, on this intergenerational aspect, the sources mention figures within the legal system itself around 1981. What's the significance there?
That's right. Judges, court officers, people who started their careers around that pivotal time. They're described as potentially acting as amplifiers or dampeners for the MK Ultra frequency grid.
Even unknowingly?
Even if they weren't consciously aware of it, yes. The idea presented is that the legal system itself might have become a conduit for these alleged intergenerational patterns.
Okay, this is heavy stuff. And it brings us to a very contemporary element in your materials. The case of Karen Reed.
Yes, the ongoing case.
For listeners who might not be following it closely, could you just briefly introduce it and explain its connection to the Norfolk Superior Courthouse?
Sure. The Karen Reed case involves the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe back in January 2022 in Canton, Massachusetts.
Okay.
Karen Reed, who was his girlfriend at the time, was charged with his murder. The case has generated a huge amount of local media attention, and crucially for our discussion, it's being tried within the jurisdiction of the Norfolk Superior Courthouse.
So the exact location we've been discussing all along.
The very same one. It's the setting for this current, very public legal drama.
And the sources you share bring up some really interesting angles on this case, especially when you view it through the lens of everything else we've just talked about.
They certainly do. For instance, the defense has been pushing for a third-party culprit defense.
Meaning someone else was responsible.
Exactly. They initially focused on someone named Colin Albert. The judge put some restrictions on that due to lack of direct evidence initially, but she has indicated she might allow the defense to point to others, like Brian Higgins or Brian Albert, if they can present sufficient evidence connecting them. So that's a major point of contention right now.
And the defense has also made some pretty serious allegations about the investigation itself, haven't they? Particularly about the lead investigator, Michael Proctor.
Yes, big allegations. The defense has claimed evidence planting and bias by State Trooper Proctor, pointing to his close personal connections with the Albert family, who were present at the house where O'Keefe was found.
And Proctor was later fired, wasn't he?
He was, yes. Which has led to speculation in some online communities and commentary that perhaps he's being set up as a fall guy to protect others.
And how does this idea of judicial mimicry fit into the Karen Reed case, according to your sources?
Well, the sources draw a line connecting this idea, this repeating of patterns of perceived injustice, to both the current Karen Reed case and the very famous historical Sacco and Vanzetti case.
Also from Norfolk County.
Also tried within the Norfolk County legal system, yes. The suggestion is that there might be an underlying pattern, maybe linked to those energetic elements we discussed earlier, in how justice plays out or is perceived to play out at that specific courthouse.
So the idea is that past events or energies might be somehow echoing or repeating within the courthouse environment today?
That's the interpretation offered in the sources, suggesting it could be a mechanism by which these things replay.
Okay. This is where the narrative takes another pretty sharp turn, moving into the idea of energetic clearing and unwinding things at the courthouse.
Right. Active interventions.
The sources actually describe specific rituals that were supposedly performed there. What was the intention behind these actions? Why do this?
The main intention described in your sources was to try and break that alleged frequency lock and karmic vault tied to Box 1981, and also to counteract that sealed Saturnian spell they believe is affecting the courthouse.
Oh. What did these rituals involve?
They involve steps like, first, recognizing the purported true nature of Box 1981, seeing it not just as files, but as this energetic anchor. Then, declaring a clear intention to unlock its energies, and using specific visualization techniques. Think of it as an attempt to energetically reset the space.
And there was a specific ritual mentioned, wasn't there? Something about truth.
Yes, the courthouse clearing ritual Truth may anchor here.
Okay.
Its steps, as described, included things like declaring the courthouse a sanctuary, energetically anchoring certain symbolic elements within the space, maybe related to truth or justice, and then concluding with a final blessing. The goal was sealing the intention for truth and justice to flow freely there.
Breaking that sealed Saturnian spell, essentially.
That was the stated aim, yes,
Yeah.
to restore what's perceived as the natural flow of truth within the building.
Now, before even symbolically approaching Box 1981, the sources mentioned some preparatory energetic work. What did that entail?
That's right. There was an effort described to clear any sort of dark or distorted energies lingering in and around the courthouse first.
Like cleaning the slate.
Kind of. It involved practices like visualizing the entire building being washed in white light, a form of energetic cleansing, and also constructing a symbolic wall of bricks, or wall of light.
A wall. For what purpose?
The intention described was to allow only truth to enter, creating an energetic barrier to prevent old negative frequencies from reactivating, or new distortions from coming in after Box 1981 was symbolically opened or cleared.
Interesting. And what about the mention of trapped souls? And a specific name, Aloria Thorn.
Yes, the sources describe performing soul invitation rituals.
They do what?
The stated goal was to release any trapped souls believed to be connected to the courthouse's history, perhaps tied to past injustices that occurred there.
And Aloria Thorn, who was she?
She's described as a courthouse clerk from the past, someone who allegedly tried to expose wrongdoing but was silenced. Speaking her name, according to these sources, was seen as significant in breaking what they call the foundational spell, allowing the courthouse to metaphorically breathe again.
So the big picture goal of all this energetic work,
Yeah.
as presented in your sources, what was it ultimately?
The sources state the overarching intention was multifaceted: to heal the energetic wounds of the courthouse building and the land it sits on, to liberate any trapped spirits connected to it, and ultimately to restore the flow of truth and justice to that specific space. The work is explicitly described as unwinding the spell and reclaiming a space hijacked for illusion.
Reclaiming a space hijacked for illusion. Quite a phrase.
It is.
Okay, finally, before we wrap up this deep dive, the sources you provided just briefly touch on some other potential connections in the Canton area. What were those?
Yeah, just a couple of quick mentions. One was about Freemasonry in Canton, noting its historical presence there. And the other was a much more speculative narrative involving what are termed daughter sacrifice networks, allegedly operating within families linked to the courtroom system.
Right, and it's important, as you say, to stress that these latter concepts are presented as highly speculative narratives within the materials provided.
Absolutely. Very much on the speculative end of the spectrum presented in the sources.
Indeed. Well, this deep dive into the sources you shared has revealed a truly complex, almost labyrinthine narrative, all centered around the Norfolk Superior Courthouse.
It really has woven together a lot of different threads.
The convergence of these alleged Saturnian spells, the ideas about potential intergenerational programming linked back to 1981, and then the very current unfolding Karen Reed trial. It paints a fascinating, if sometimes unsettling, picture. What stands out most to you as a connective tissue here?
I think what's most fascinating consistently across these sources is this core idea of locations holding energetic imprints.
Right, the building itself.
Yeah, imprints of past events, past intentions. And then the corresponding idea that proactive efforts, like these clearing rituals, can be undertaken to try and shift or clear those imprints. It certainly adds another dimension to how we might think about our interactions with historical places, legal spaces, any place with a long history, really.
Absolutely. This whole exploration raises some pretty profound questions, I think, for you, our listener, to consider. Questions about the nature of justice itself, the potential for hidden influences, maybe unseen patterns within our societal structures, and ultimately how we determine what's true when we're faced with such conflicting narratives, some of which are based on conventional evidence and others on, well, much more esoteric interpretations.
It definitely challenges you to think about where information comes from and how we evaluate it.
It does. We encourage you to continue reflecting on these themes, mull them over, and consider what resonates most deeply with you from this dive. The layers of history, the potential hidden dynamics, the current events surrounding this courthouse and this case. There's certainly a great deal to contemplate.
A lot to unpack, for sure.
Thanks for taking this journey with us in this complex material. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.